Welcome to a presentation from the Academic Writing Program at the University of Maryland. I'm Linda McCree, Director of the Academic Writing Program, and today I'll be introducing stasis theory, a rhetorical concept that's one of the foundations of English 101 here at Maryland. In English 101, we emphasize the concept of inquiry, of delving into an issue and being able to ask good questions about an issue as a central element of academic thinking and writing. When we talk about inquiry, we don't just mean asking questions and getting answers. Inquiry is part of a more reflective process. It begins with us reflecting on an issue, maybe listening in on a conversation or considering our own experiences, and then asking relevant, thoughtful questions about the issue, questions that will lead us to knowledge that we can then contribute to the debate and the understanding of the issue. In English 101 and in other courses, you'll be asked to discover your own research topic rather than being assigned one. A good research topic grows out of a good question. But how do we ask good questions? Well, it's a skill that can be developed, and in English 101, our tool for developing good questioning skills draws on stasis theory. So, what is stasis theory? And how can stasis theory help you in academic writing? Stasis theory has its origins in classical rhetorical theory. It offers an organized set of questions or categories for determining where disputes issue, or we could say that it's a tool for understanding what's at issue. And like lots of things in rhetorical theory, it's useful both for inventing arguments, coming up with your own arguments, and analyzing arguments, understanding the arguments of others. I said that stasis theory comes from classical rhetorical theory, but more specifically, stasis theory comes from legal theory, where it was, and still is, important to resolve what questions are at issue before a case can be settled. Think of the questions that matter in a legal case. For example, let's think about a murder investigation. We might first ask, well, what happened? Who did it? And we might think about exactly what kind of crime was it? Then we might consider, well, was there premeditation in the crime? Was there intent? Then we might think about, is there a guilty person, someone to charge in the case? And finally, how should the guilty person be punished? For an example of how any of this matters in a criminal case, listen to this introduction to a report from National Public Radio regarding the tragic case involving South African Olympic track athlete Oscar Pistorius and the shooting death of his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, on February 13, 2013. As you listen to the National Public Radio report, try to recognize the questions that you see here in the report.
Olympic runner Oscar Pistorius was back in a South African courtroom today in a bail hearing that sounded a lot like a trial. Both sides presented their versions of how it came to be that Pistorius killed his girlfriend. He admits he pumped 4 bullets through a bathroom door in the early morning hours of Valentine's Day, but he says he thought an intruder was behind the door and the death of Riva Steenkamp was a horrible accident, not premeditated murder.
That report about the bail hearing before Pistorius' actual trial began makes it clear that there's no dispute between the two sides about what happened or who did it. Pistorius and police both agree that he shot 4 bullets into the bathroom, resulting in Miss Steenkamp's death. But after that question, there is disagreement. While the prosecutors say the crime was premeditated, Pistorius claims his intent was not to kill his girlfriend, but to protect himself from an intruder he believed was in the room. And whether or not he's guilty of a crime here will depend on what the court agrees about the issue of intent. If this was premeditated, then he's guilty of murder. But if it was an accident, he's not guilty of murder. Just as police officers and lawyers need to determine what's at issue in a criminal investigation, we need to be able to ask good questions and figure out what's at issue in any inquiry. Stasis theory provides the questions to help us determine what's at issue in any line of inquiry. So what can you do with stasis theory, and how can it help you ask good research questions? Well, we all know how to ask questions, and at some point you probably learned about the basic W questions of journalism: who, what, where, when, and why. Let's look at an everyday topic, one you may not really think about as particularly academic in nature, and we'll think about these questions. Let's talk about gossip. If I asked you to come up with questions about the issue of gossip, you might come up with these questions. inspired by the W, questions of journalism. What is gossip? Who gossips? Why do people gossip? Where do people gossip? And when do people gossip? These are a great start, and there would be academic interest in all of these, as we'll think about in a few minutes, from various academic disciplines. But of course, there are more questions than just these. Could you invent some of your own? Maybe you came up with questions like these. Does gossip hurt people? Is it good or bad? Should we gossip? Do some people gossip more than others? How can we prevent it? Well, we could just try to keep coming up with questions randomly, but stasis theory offers us a heuristic that can help us understand what is at issue in a situation and what's being discussed in a text. In other words, it's useful both for invention, for coming up with something, and for analysis, for understanding what someone else has said. I think you'll find that having a tool for coming up with questions will be useful, both when you try to write and when you read, study, and argue, anytime that you need to think critically. I mentioned before that stasis theory offers us questions in a certain order, and that order is very important in understanding how stasis questions are useful. If we think about these questions, we might start to recognize that there are similarities in them, and from these similarities we can start to make categories that align with the categories of the stases. So, for instance, some of the questions are really all about the very existence and essence of this concept of gossip. Now, perhaps these don't really seem like arguable questions to you, but in academic conversation, the very existence and essence of something is often debated and is often the foundation of a broader dispute. In the example of the Pistorius case, we saw that deciding whether the shooting was perceived self-defense or premeditated murder was a central question, the question that we had to start with before moving on to anything else. And that's a question of existence and essence. What really happened? And how do we define what happened? And actually, it's not only in academic and legal debate that we argue over what happened and how to define terms in a debate. We really do it in everyday life, too. Watch this clip from the classic comedy I Love Lucy as Ricky and Lucy dispute the very definition of gossip.
I want to speak to you about gossiping.
Gossiping?
Yes. I think that gossiping is vicious and petty. And I think a gossip is the lowest form of human life.
Oh, so do I.
You don't seem to get my message. I was talking about you.
Me? Gossip?
What do you call what you were doing on the phone?
Well, it wasn't gossiping. I prefer to think of it as a mutual exchange of vital information.
All right.
In the scene just before this one, Lucy was talking on the phone with a friend for a very long time. Now, Ricky, as you just heard, uses a definition of gossiping and categorizes a person who gossips to lay the foundation for his implication that gossip is bad and that Lucy shouldn't do it. But Lucy, as you heard, has a very different definition of her actions. She wasn't gossiping, she says, which she agrees gossiping is a despicable act. Instead, what she was doing was engaging in a mutual exchange of vital information. With that definition of her actions, how can we possibly think what she was doing was bad? While the first category of questions in stasis theory considers the nature and definition of an issue, the next category concerns questions of cause and effect. So questions like, why do we gossip? Does gossip hurt people? Those are questions of cause and effect. Once we've considered questions of cause and effect, we're ready to think about other questions. And those are questions of value. Is gossip good or bad? And finally, once we've considered questions about value, we're ready to ask questions about action. Should we gossip? How do we prevent gossip? Obviously, we're not going to argue that we should gossip if we don't think gossip has some value, that is, if we don't think it's good. And we won't argue to prevent gossip if we don't think that at some level gossip is bad, that is, if we've decided it has negative value. So rather than randomly considering questions, stasis theory offers us a way to organize and categorize the questions we hear or ask. In each category, there's a set of questions, and they build on one another. And once we start understanding these categories, we can also use the categories and the questions in each of them to start prompting our own invention of questions, to find other ways into a debate about an issue. Let's, for instance, consider questions of cause and effect. Using the questions in this category, what caused something, what are its effects, we can generate more questions about gossip, including more specific questions. So we might think of questions such as, how did gossip evolve? What does it do for us? What's its effect? Does it protect us in some way? Do we use it as a kind of defense mechanism? That would be another question about its effect. And generally, what kinds of effects does it have on a broader community? So from just this simple act of coming up with questions in a category, such as cause and effect, we start to recognize there are many potential research topics in this question. They would have different interest in different disciplines. They're great questions to move us to the next level of research and consideration. Well, now it's time for you to try this out on your own. Here again are the categories of the Stasis and the general questions that each asks. Think about the topic that you're interested in and try and generate questions from these Stasis categories. What questions can you ask about your topic, and how can you use Stasis theory to help you ask important questions in that topic? Thanks for your attention.